When people cling to unchanging dogma, even with the best of intentions, it can lead to real harm. So if we care about truth, and if we care about people, then we have to let wisdom guide us, not just ancient tradition. Because certainty without compassion isn't faith, it's control. And we can do so much better than that. Welcome to another bonus edition of the MTB Podcast, a segment of the weekly episode that I call Afterthoughts. This is my favorite part of these weekly presentations because it gives me a chance to dig a little deeper into something that came up during the main episode. In this week's main presentation, we focused on the readings for Trinity Sunday, and I spent a lot of time talking about wisdom, not as some abstract prize for the perfect people, but as a way of showing up in the world. Because wisdom isn't about being right all the time. It's about growing. It's about seeing new things or seeing old things in new ways. It's about asking better questions and letting go of that anxious need to cling to certainty. And that's the real magic, isn't it? Not knowing everything, but being willing to learn. And that's what makes this next part a little ironic. You'd think that institutions built on ideas like faith, growth, and spiritual transformation would be really into evolving, right? But oddly enough, they tend to turn into the places that fear change the most. It's almost like a caterpillar yelling, "I'll be a butterfly over my dead body." Instead of listening for fresh insight or paying attention to how humanity has matured over time, some religious folks, they just double down on ancient interpretations like they were carved into stone by the divine hand of a celestial courtroom stenographer. They claim to be led by the Spirit, but only if the Spirit agrees not to contradict anything written down 1,600 years ago or more, I guess. So here's the question I want to tackle right now. Are we really listening to the Spirit behind the message? Or are we just plugging our ears and pretending we already know it all? So let's talk about what wisdom actually requires. Because it's not just about age or education or being the smartest person in the room. Though, if you are the smartest person in the room, congratulations. That sounds exhausting. Real wisdom has a lot more to do with things like curiosity, openness, and courage. Why courage? Well, because it takes courage to admit that you might not have all the answers. And it takes openness to let go of those answers when better ones come along. Wise people aren't the ones who know everything. They're the ones who know how much they don't know. They ask questions. They pay attention to context. They care about the spirit of things, not just the exact words written down in a time and culture that look nothing like our own. Wisdom doesn't say, "But that's what it says in the book." Wisdom says, "What did they mean by that? And is it still true now?" And if that sounds like you're still figuring it all out, well, good. That's not a flaw. That's the point. We're all still learning. If we weren't, we wouldn't need wisdom in the first place. Look, let me give you an everyday example of clinging to specific words and actively ignoring the spirit of something. I'm willing to bet this is an example we've all experienced in our lives, probably more times than we can even remember. So here it is. One person says something, and the other person gets mad. The first person clarifies and says something like, "Sorry, that's not what I meant. What I meant was yada, yada, yada." Now, instead of saying, "Oh, okay, that makes more sense," the second person stays angry and insists, "Well, that's not what you said." And things escalate from there. If communication is about trying to share a specific message, then the first person continues to try to communicate, tries to clarify what was meant, while the second person basically shuts down communication and conversation by continuing to insist that's not what you said. A similar scenario is when the second person starts focusing on explaining why they misunderstood the original message. This version isn't about effective communication either, because it's simply a way to blame the first person and prove they were wrong. Neither of these similar scenarios are about wisdom. They're not about being open and curious. They're not about trying to understand. They're about wanting to win and demonstrate that the other person was wrong. That's not wisdom in action. That's ego. So here's a gentle challenge for the week. Pay attention to the moments when you find yourself focused more on defending your position than on asking questions and listening. Because when we're spending our time defending, that's usually a red flag that we've stopped growing and we've started guarding. And wisdom doesn't need a security system. If anything, it needs a welcome mat. So let's talk about dogma. And I mean that in the most neutral, non-snarky way that I can manage anyways. Dogma, at its core, just means a principle or set of beliefs that's considered authoritative and not to be disputed. And hey, most traditions, religions, even secular institutions have dogma of some kind. It's not always bad. Dogma can give an organization structure. It can give a group identity, even a sense of continuity. But here's the thing. Dogma becomes anti-wisdom when it absolutely flat out refuses to change, even when the world clearly has. When people treat ancient texts like instruction manuals with no expiration dates, well, that's not spiritual strength. That's intellectual stubbornness. It's like using a recipe from 800 BC and refusing to admit that maybe food safety standards have evolved just a little since then. Now, I want to be fair here. I genuinely believe a lot of dogmatic Christians are trying to do what's right. They're not trying to be rigid or judgmental. That's not their underlying goal. They're trying to be faithful. And that's admirable. But here's the question I think we all need to ask. Is clinging to tradition more important than caring for people in the world today? Because when holding on to a rule or a translation or a theological opinion ends up hurting someone, maybe it's time to revisit what that rule was supposed to be for in the first place. Was it about creating a just, compassionate, loving world? Or was it just about making sure no one colors outside the lines? I mean, wisdom isn't about perfect obedience. It's about thoughtful discernment. And if we really believe in a living spirit, whether metaphorical or literal, then we ought to be listening. Not plugging our ears and shouting, la, 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 tradition says no. La, 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 I'm not listening to you. Let's be the kind of people who ask better questions. Not because we're trying to rebel, but because we're trying to love better. That's what discernment can help us with. And that's a kind of faithfulness the world desperately needs right now. Okay, I do want to talk about what it actually means to be what I call a values-based Christian. Because I think some people hear that and assume I've just taken all their theology, set it on fire, and danced away yelling, no rules, no reverence. But it's actually almost the opposite. It's not about abandoning values. It's about living them, breathing new life into them, asking, how do these stories, these teachings, these traditions, how do they help us live better right now? No, a values-based Christian doesn't need to believe in all this supernatural stuff in the Bible or the supernatural stuff that's taught by the church. But they certainly can, as long as it's not making them foolish and keeping them from acting with wisdom. However, a values-based Christian does not worship the words of the Bible. We definitely don't believe they are the indisputable words of some divine being. Even if a values-based Christian believes the texts in the Bible were divinely inspired, they don't believe those writings are inerrant. That's why our goal is to engage with the Bible's wisdom. That means reading sacred texts not with the goal of proving a point or winning an argument, but reading them through the lens of human values. Things like dignity, compassion, justice, humility, and love. You know, the stuff Jesus allegedly talked a lot about. It also means we don't pretend these texts dropped from the sky fully formed. They were shaped by culture, by politics, by limited science, and definitely by very specific contexts. The Bible, just like any religious writing, is both time-bound and culture-bound. So if something sounds a little off or wildly inappropriate today, it probably is. And that's okay, because when you value people more than the words in ancient books, you can say, you know what? That doesn't work anymore. And then just keep moving forward. Truth for values-based Christians isn't some fossilized relic we guard in a museum. It's a path we walk. Sometimes we take a wrong turn. Sometimes we have to stop and reevaluate the map, but we keep walking. We keep learning. We keep growing, because wisdom isn't a destination. It's a direction, or maybe even a way of life. So no, being a values-based Christian isn't tossing the whole tradition out the window. In fact, I think you're honoring it more by letting it evolve. If you do that while still believing in the supernatural, you and I will find a lot of common ground, because we'll be identifying all sorts of shared values. I no longer believe in the supernatural, but we'll generally be on the same page, because your faith will be a truly living faith, not a locked box full of ancient rules you have to protect at all costs. If anything, your faith will become a toolkit for building a better world today. And that, I would argue, is the most faithful thing you can do. Anyway, I think this all matters because it isn't just an abstract debate between Team Dogma and Team Wisdom. The stakes are real. When people cling to unchanging dogma, even with the best of intentions, it can lead to real harm. We've seen it. LGBTQ plus folks are pushed out of their churches. Women are denied leadership, or in some cases even autonomy. People of other faiths, or no faith at all, are dismissed, or worse yet, demonized. And it's not just a few fringe actors that are doing this. This rigid thinking has helped give rise to movements like Christian nationalism in the United States, where exclusion and control are held up as moral virtues. It's tragic, really, because the original messages, if you strip away the centuries of fear and power grabbing, those original messages are often rooted in love, justice, and community. That's what happens when we shift our focus from what does this literally say to What is this trying to do in the world? Embracing the spirit of these teachings doesn't make someone less faithful. It makes us more compassionate, more inclusive, and frankly, more helpful to the people around us. And look, if there is a Holy Spirit out there trying to whisper wisdom into the ears of the faithful, I would imagine she's pretty frickin' frustrated right now. Like standing in the back of the church with a megaphone yelling, "I said stop hurting people in my name," level of frustrated. But a lot of folks have those spiritual earmuffs on, and they're only listening to certain interpretations of some of the specific words that were written 2,000 years ago in a totally different world. So if we care about truth, and if we care about people, then we have to let wisdom guide us, not just tradition. We have to ask ourselves, is the way we're interpreting this bringing more love, more justice, more healing into the world? Or is it just helping us feel more certain? Because certainty without compassion isn't faith. It's control. And we can do so much better than that. Okay, let's see if I can wrap this all up for us. Earlier, I offered what I called a gentle challenge, to notice the moments when you're more interested in defending your position than in asking questions or truly listening. That's not intended to be a trap. It's meant to be a mirror. And it's one that all of us, myself included, need to look into from time to time. Because here's the thing. Being a dogmatic Christian might seem safe. It's tidy. You've got your box of ancient beliefs, all labeled and laminated, locked up nice and tight and protected at all costs. But life, real life, isn't a neat little well-organized box. Real life is messy. And wisdom thrives in the mess. And that's where we need it the most. That's why being what I call a values-based Christian isn't about having all the answers. It's about asking better questions to understand the mess. It's about identifying the strong human-centered values that are like woven through these ancient stories and then actually trying to live them out in ways that matter today. Not the stories, not the specific words, but the values that we can find underneath. So if trying to live a good, values-based life sometimes feels like you're just fumbling through the dark, that's okay. You're not lost. You're just learning. Because wisdom isn't a destination. Wisdom is a way of life. Thanks for joining me for this episode of Afterthoughts. If you want to keep up on everything I'm doing, please head over to thecodaproject.com and subscribe to my newsletter. You'll get notifications whenever I publish anything, and I'll also keep you updated on the weekly live streams of Mythologizing the Bible. Also, if you subscribe for free over at thecodaproject.com, you'll start receiving my weekly resource called The Weekly Compass. This is a brief, once-a-week guide on a single core value. Think of it as a mini lesson plan for personal growth. It's perfect for families, students, and adults because I include discussion questions designed for each age group. Each weekly issue centers on a short reflection about the week's value, followed by discussion questions that are tailored for different age groups, from kids to college students to adults. And then a simple take action step, like a small challenge or exercise you can do to put that value into practice. Especially for families, it's designed to be an easy way to ensure that at least once a week you're making time to talk about morality, ethics, and core values. So if you're interested, go subscribe for free at thecodaproject.com. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, keep thinking, keep questioning, and keep seeking the truth.